be hosting and speaking with you about fundraising for startups. So if we get started, as I mentioned earlier, today is brought to you by Astrolabs and Legal Circle. So Astrolabs is, and probably most of you already know, but they're co-working spaces. They provide licensing. I believe they're part of the DMCC free zone, and really support and help to drive digital growth for the startups in the region. So Astrolabs has done some great work and continues to do so. So reach out to them if you require any support, or if you're at the stage where you're looking to set up. Astrolabs is definitely somewhere you should go and have a chat to. So a Legal Circle is a law firm. We're based in UAE, but we practice multi-jurisdictional law, so Saudi, UAE, and of course we do cross-jurisdiction across UK and the US. We focus on providing efficient, high quality and cost-effective legal services. So we understand as an entrepreneur or startup, it's generally difficult to pay extortion fees for legal. So we have different products that we offer to startups and entrepreneurs to make sure that they are getting excellent quality legal advice for a cost-effective amount. So our mission is really to disrupt the market and commercial legal industry through innovative business models. So please reach out and maybe ask some questions on what we have to offer for our startups. Excellent. So today I will be presenting. My name is Soraya Turk, as I mentioned earlier. I'm the managing partner of Legal Circle, and we have for the last few years really been positioning ourselves to be the front runners in this space, because we found that there's quite a gap in terms of legal knowledge, expertise, and quality legal advice at a cost-effective price for entrepreneurs. So we set out to really be able to support entrepreneurs in the space, particularly private equity and capital raising, as we know there's quite a boom at this stage. Excellent. So if we go into the presentation, what I wanted to start with today was asking yourselves a question. Are you making the 5 biggest startup mistakes in fundraising? Now, what are they? So the first thing we generally see in the market is that lots of startups with great ideas and very, very ambitious to really get out there and start up and scale up are very desperate to raise funds. So they end up falling into the trap of taking money from anyone who will give it to them. And why I say this is a bit of a trap is that today that person might seem like a great idea, investing you and giving you money that you need. But tomorrow, once you've gone through fundraising rounds and you've got the money that you require and you've actually started to lift this company off the ground and gain momentum, some of the investors will not be ideal investors, either because they don't know enough about your business, because they ask too many questions that perhaps then stall you from making progress in the business. Perhaps they decide later on that they want to pull their money out and ask for a return of their money. We've actually seen this a number of times. So it's really important to have those discussions early on with your investors about why they want to invest, what value can they bring to the table as investors, and then whether it's they want to see a quick return, because the reality is that if they've put in money today, they're not going to be making dividends or be able to pull it out tomorrow. And so these are some conversations that you need to be having with investors. And remember, it's all about smart money, and smart money is where the investor that's giving you money has real value to add to the company that he's investing in. Now, raising too much money too early on, what do I mean by that? What I mean by that is when you raise money, you need to give equity in return. So you may not be giving equity today as of today's date, but you will be giving equity in the future. And what happens is, as you're giving a stake of your company, you're reducing or watering down the amount of ownership that you and other shareholders may have in the company. So you always need to be making sure and making certain that you understand the implications of raising money and what that means in terms of ownership down the track. And the way we track this is through a cap table. So I think most of you, if you're startups or entrepreneurs or already started to fundraise, you know what a cap table is. And we will look at that later on in this presentation as well. So the third biggest mistake I see is that some startups don't have a cap table at all, or if they have one, it's not really thought through, and so they can't really clearly see what the effects of raising money from different shareholders is, and where what the ownership split will look like down the track. So it's very important to have a cap table as soon as you start to raise funds from investors. The fourth mistake is giving out fundraising notes without the consideration or considering the impact of those. So what we see as well is that, people will go onto Y Combinator, or they'll go onto some other websites and they download a safe note without looking at what the terms or the clauses are in that. They simply print that off, send it to an investor and get them to sign. That's all well and good today. But what happens down the track? What happens down the track when that investor says, but hey, in that safe note, there's a most favorable nation clause, which means if you've given anybody else more favorable terms than me, they should also apply to me. Or you gave me a discount and your discount was 20%. Or, for example, there could be in a safe note or convertible note a term which says if you haven't reached a particular milestone within a set period of time, that the money could be paid back. So, are you thinking about what is in that safe note or convertible note? It's not just a case of raising money for the sake of it and printing off a note, giving it to an investor, getting his signature and money, and the rest is bygones. It's, in fact, a very calculated process, and it's one that needs to be. So that's another mistake we see lots of startups make in fundraising. And the fifth one is giving up too much control of the company because you don't understand the impact of certain investor clauses. So again, this is very much about having the knowledge of what clauses are in the contracts and what you've actually negotiated with an investor. So perhaps not in the very early stages, but as you progress through the startup rounds, which we'll go through in due course as well, you'll have more savvy investors, for example, a venture capital perhaps, where they are very clear and specific on their involvement in the fundraising rounds and the scope of their involvement. If you've had any other experiences or any other mistakes that perhaps I've not touched on, but you want to share either with the audience or with myself, please put it in the chat box and I'll have a chance to look at that a little later on. All right, so if you look at the agenda today, I'm going to quickly run through angel investments, why choose an angel investor, what to look for in an angel investor, do's and don'ts, and where you can find them. I'll really quickly go through that before moving on to part 2, where we talk about incorporation and the corporate structure, which is suitable and conducive for a company which is going to be fundraising through and beyond a series at seed stage, understanding the fundraising process, the impact of fundraising, the instruments. So we'll look at safe notes and convertible notes and what other instruments, other legal documents. So beyond the safe and convertibles, what other documents might you enter into, and then how to become investor ready. And hopefully we'll have a chance towards the end to answer some of your questions. Excellent. So just really quickly and briefly, most of you already know what an angel investor is. And simply an angel investor is generally a person who's a high net worth individual who has an appetite and perhaps a risk appetite for investing into startups. Where I have here funding in smart money, it's because smart money is where the angel investor either has some industry knowledge or relationship and networks within the industry you're in and can really support you to grow the company. So this is, as I touched on the previous slide, with one of the biggest mistakes we find startups making is that they're not looking at smart money, but rather just money for the sake of raising and developing their idea. So the do's and don'ts. Sorry, I don't know if I've missed. No, yeah. So do's and don'ts. So when you are fundraising, the ideal scenario is to really plan for the future, choose the right partners to set the cap table up to be investable later on. So remember, when you're first starting out in fundraising, the amounts that you're going to be raising are going to be quite small or reasonably small compared to later stages. But it really makes a difference who is on that cap table, because later on, when you have VCs or smart investors, if you want to put it that way, They will look at the cap table to see who is on there, what contributions they make, and what investment and stake in the company they have. So you really want to be planning for the future and making sure that your cap table is nice and investor ready. You also want to test the relationship out. So, before taking money, perhaps build a relationship with that investor, road test the potential investor. What value are they going to add? Are they going to deliver on the things that they say? Are they going to be that investor that in 6 months, turns around and says, uh-oh, I didn't realize, but the money that I've given to you, I really need for something else, and now I want that money back. Are you going to be having that conversation? Or are you going to be having a conversation with an investor who says, well, I don't like the way you're taking and building this company. This is not what I expected. I thought there'd be, more time and money invested on, say, branding, and I don't see that happening, and I really want out. And you'd be surprised, but there are investors that do this. Giving away too much, again, what we said in terms of, promising too much either control or too much shares in a company is not favorable at a very early stage. Never, ever give away half of your company in a seed round, for example. It's really typically in early stages, 10% is very common, a max of 25% within the early stages. Okay, so we look at angel investors. Where can we find them? Well, there's lots of different angel investment associations. In the UAE, we've got Emirates Angels, we have Wamina, which is an angel investment platform. There's Dubai Angel Investors. Of course, then there's incubators and hubs, lots of them in the region. So FinTech, Hub 71, Startup Bootcamp, Shara, In5. So many of these will actually invest small amounts and stage in the company. LinkedIn and networking. So lots of angel investors are very active on LinkedIn, and we'll talk about the type of portfolios they invest in and what they're interested. So it's really important to keep an eye out on those platforms to have conversations with investors you could think could be real added value to you. Okay, so let's get down to business now. Let's talk about what structure or what do you need to ultimately be structuring the company around so that you can make it attractive for VCs and investors. And in fact, if you've been through Y Combinator, if you've been successful for those, they will often tell you to have this structure, and they'll often make you set up a holding in a specific jurisdiction. But let's look at the first slide anyway, and I can talk you through and answer some questions on this. So generally, when you first set up, you'll start up with your operational entity, and that makes a lot of sense. It makes sense because without an operational entity, you can't actually run the business that you want to run and need investment for. So generally what you would do is start up with an operational entity, whether that be in the UAE, the KSA, Egypt, Jordan, wherever you are in the GCC. And then that works for as long as you're building traction or gaining traction, building some revenues. But at some point when you have the discussions with investors in your, say, Series A or perhaps even seed stage, they'll want to see an SPV. Now, what is an SPV? SPV stands for a special purpose vehicle, otherwise known as a holding company as well. And they can be set up relatively cheaply these days at the DIFC or the ADGM. Now, why you would put a holding company above your operational company, and particularly in a common law jurisdiction, is one, to give your investors greater protection, because in a common law jurisdiction, all of the agreements and the documents that you draft could be upheld and enforceable and are in line with that jurisdiction, as opposed to some of the mainland laws in UAE, KSA, or Egypt. So it gives a level of protection. It also separates your investors from the operational companies and any liabilities that you might have at that level of the operation. So it's a really good idea keeping arm's length apart your investors and your assets and your IP from the operational entity where, for example, you have all your service agreements, your employment agreements, your loan documentation, and whatever it is, if, for example, you've got loan with the banks, etc. So ideally, after you've set up an operational, if you can simultaneously or do it a little bit later, is set up a holding company above the operational entities. Now, the holding company is the company level where you have your investors, and all the instruments you use or provide to investors will be at the holding company level. And your founders also will be at the SPV. So again, ADGM, DIFC in the UAE are the most prominent two sort of jurisdictions where you can set up a holding company. But we've seen as well many startups set up in either Singapore, the UK, Cayman Islands, or BVI. So if, for example, you're part of the Y Combinator, they will generally say that they want one which is in a neutral jurisdiction, either Cayman or BVI or Singapore, etc. If you've got any questions on that, please do put them in the chat box. All right, so understanding the fund process. So again, many of you may know this, but for those of you who don't, fundraising is a process, and it generally starts with a pre-seed round, which is, you know, where your family and friends might give you some money to support your idea, and they may give it to you for future equity, or they may give it to you as a loan at that stage. But really, that's where, you know, you might just set up a company, maybe hire one or two people, maybe not even that, but with that small amount, you can implement your idea. Then you get to the stage where you really need to increase the funding that you have and the capital that you have, either to hire more people, develop your idea a little bit more, MVP, for example, if you're in technology. And so you would enter into a new round, which is a seed round. Again, in this round, of small amounts of money, they're not huge amounts, and you may start to extend this to people in the market that you think are high net worth individuals, also known as angel investors. So now, once you've got your seed round money, generally companies will start to invest that into their idea, really gain some traction and start to generate some revenues, but now need more money to scale up and perhaps launch a product or scale up the business. So you move into then a Series A round. So in the Series A round, again, there could be the participation of angel investors, or you might at this stage start talking to some venture capital whose mandate is, for example, to invest in a Series A. After Series A, you'd go into Series B. Series B is really about the growth stage. Now you're looking at, you know, larger VCs, you're looking at larger amounts of money, and you're really focused on growth and scaling the company. It could be now not just in UAE, but across the GCC, for example. And then you've got Series C and further, and really it depends on how much money you need and what your plans are for expansion. But Series B, C, and beyond start to get, you know, very serious, and we are starting to talk about that large amounts of money. You probably saw, for example, very recently, but Forbes magazine had, you know, top 50 startups and talking about the different stages they were in, and you can tell based even on, you know, a recount of what the startups are doing in the later series, they start to talk about some serious money, 50 mil, 60 mil, 70 and beyond. All right, so some common questions that we're often asked by lots of startups. So I thought I'd just put these on here, and then I'll take a little look later to see if anybody's asked me these. But lots of people ask, you know, how do we determine how much money we need to raise? So we get that there's the fundraising process, and it starts from a seed stage, it goes all the way to Series C. But how do we know in each round what it is that we need to raise? Now, that is a very subjective question. It's subjective because how much do you as a company, as a startup, need to develop your idea? What industry are you in? What are you actually developing? There will be different industries or different technologies, depending on what you're in, that will require different amounts of money. And so it's really important that you have a plan and you sit together with either an account or somebody that does a feasibility study and says, okay, this is the amount that we need, and this is, you know, if we've managed to fundraise this amount, this is what we can do with it, and really have a plan for your operation, for your growth, and what milestones you're going to reach. And that will guide you in terms of, one, how much money you should be asking from investors, but two, also to support your pitch to them about why you need that amount. and of course help you to reach the next milestone where you then will move into another fundraising round. So lots of people ask, is it a linear process? Does fundraising begin from pre-seed to seed? So whilst the process can be fluid, typically it is quite linear. So typically it will be about a pre-seed where it's a small amount, and then you increase that amount of money. And then as you expand and grow and scale up, it'll become more and more. And generally what we see, and I've never seen it otherwise, is where it goes to Series A and Series B. What can happen is that you can have some bridging processes between, say, a Series A and Series B round, if you feel that you need to when you're during that process. But generally it is quite linear. Another question is, how do the rounds open and close? So when you've raised the money you've set out to raise, generally that round will close. So let's say, for example, you've done your market research and you say $600,000 is what I need in my seed stage. Once you've raised $600,000, you will then close that round, and you will use and then deploy that capital. And once you find that you need more, then you will open another round and start to talk to new investors for new money for the company. So essentially also what's an indicator is when the market value of the company is increased by that amount of money that you've raised. Okay, so when should you plan for your next raise? Again, a very subjective question, because it really depends on the deployment of funds and what you require it for and how much more that you need. But typically what we see is within about 6 to 12 months, a company is already looking at and considering their next raise and next amount of money that they need to raise from investors. Excellent. So I just wanted to take a minute to talk about the impact of fundraising. I talked about this very briefly early on in the first slides, but again, I just want to revisit this because now you're at the stage where we've just looked at the stages of fundraising, and we talked a little bit about our cap table. We'll come into that in a little bit more detail as well. But what is the impact? What is the impact of every round that you participate in? So seed, Series A, Series B, and beyond. What's actually happening at those rounds is that you're promising investors a future slice of the pie, a future slice of the company and ownership. And so with every investment round, you're watering down and diluting the shareholding in the company, not just for yourselves as founders, but for the other investors in the company as well. So it is absolutely crucial to record in the cap table the percentages that you're potentially going to be parting with in your future rounds. Now, if, for example, when you started up your company as a founder, you said, we want to be majority stake, we do not want to dilute beyond 51%, then you're going to be very strategic in what you offer investors. And I think it's always important to begin with the end in mind. What is ultimately the goal of this company? Is it to go IPO? Is it for you to own a majority stake in it forever and ever? Is it to be acquired by a completely different company and just liquidate and exit? What is your plan? Because if you begin with the end in mind, then you can work backwards and try to achieve that. And the discussions you have with investors will be guided by your ultimate goal. And also there's transparency. And I think it's always good to be transparent with people who are going to be giving you money and believing in you as a founder and in your business. So it's good to know what you plan to do. So I've just given here an example of what a cap table looks like. None of these figures are accurate, so please don't look at these and do any mathematical calculations. This is purely just to show you what a cap table looks like and the information that it records. So, it'll record who the founders are, it'll record who your investors are, the investment amount, if you've given them any discounts, and we'll talk about that a little bit later, what a discount means and how it's applied. It looks at your pre-money and post-money value, so you can determine, based on the amount of that you've raised, the potential number of shares that that particular investor will get. And of course, it looks at the investment value. and the overall capital and value of the company. Excellent. So if we go into now, what are the fundraising instruments, or what are the fundraising documents that we typically see in the fundraising process? So I don't know if you are sure of the history or the background, but essentially I think it was in 2016 in Silicon Valley where safe notes and convertible notes really became prominent. They became used, and they started to slowly flourish across the regions and be used by all of those startups who were in fundraising. So essentially, a safe note stands and is an acronym for Simple Agreement for Future Equity. And what this is an agreement which is given in exchange for cash from an investor, and it gives that investor a contractual future right to buying equity when there is an equity funding round or a liquidation event taking place. So if you've seen a safe note before, there will always be a trigger or a liquidity event. And essentially that liquidity event generally is defined as an equity funding round. And equity funding is when a shareholder, a potential investor buys shares in a company for a specific amount. And that triggers the safe notes, and everybody who has a safe note or a convertible instrument will convert into shares, depending on their commercials and what they've negotiated as being as the discount or their note. So a convertible note is a little bit different from a safe note in that a convertible note actually it's a debt instrument, and it's a debt instrument because it has a maturity date. And there also is a priority for repayment if a startup fails or before a note is actually converted. So it's distinguishable from a safe note because a safe note does not have that. So again, an equity financing round involves founders issuing investors to share in the company or the startup in exchange for cash. And the shares are either ordinary or preference shares, and there's a predetermined share price and a number of shares that's given. So an investor generally in that round of equity financing is given a subscription agreement and followed by a shareholder agreement. And we'll talk about that in the next slides as well. So if you're currently fundraising or you're using any of these notes, please type yes or no. And if you've got any specific questions on these, please type those in the chat box. And I can see we've got lots of, I can see the chat box and the Q&A increasing, so I'll come back to that shortly. So again, just as a quick recap, I think I've already covered this, but just for your benefit again, one more time, safe note versus convertible notes. I think most people, and what I see most commonly in the region with our startups, is that they are using a safe note as a convertible note. And the advantages of that is really that safe notes don't have a term. So it means it's just triggered whenever there is an equity financing round. They're not payable. Interest is not payable on a safe note as compared with a convertible note, which it has a debt element. So safes are not debts. And then they're becoming increasingly popular, and they're really taking over convertible notes, particularly in the early stage of an investment round. All right, so if you look at some key terms of a convertible note and a safe note. So generally what you might find on the notes is that they've specified a pre or post money value. Now, a pre or post money value is the value of a company, or pre-money, is the value of a company before it receives a cash from a round of financing. Whereas a post money value is the value of a company after the investment. And pre and post money all come into play upon a conversion of a safe. So when you're looking at the conversion of a safe, it does make a difference if it's on a pre or a post money value. And what we find is that most times in a safe note, it's calculated on a post money value. So what is the value of, or what is the amount of money that you've given, and what percentage and value of that is looked at by calculating the post-money value and looking at how it's converted. Now, generally what happens as well in early seed stages, and even on our Series A, is that the early investors will be given an opportunity or as an incentive, a discount rate. Now, when you're offering a discount on the value of the future price of shares, that's effectively what that discount rate means on a safe note. And it's usually given to investors in early stages, as I said. And what happens is when you're converting and working out how many shares you should be getting in exchange of the money that you gave on a safe note, they will look at the market value and the market rate of that share and then give you a discount off that. Now, what we often see as a bit of a mistake on safe notes is they've got a discount of, say, 80%, when in fact, a discount of 80% is a discount of 80%. If you want to give a discount of 20%, what you need to be saying in a safe note is that the discount rate is 80%, and therefore the discount you get is a 20%. And so we've seen this confusion on safe notes very often when it comes to negotiating and when it comes to a startup just giving a safe note without actually knowing what the implications and what the different terminologies mean. Now, a valuation cap. So again, we see this on a safe note. Sometimes they're open and there is no valuation cap, but other times there is a valuation cap or a ceiling. And ultimately, a valuation cap is a cap on the ultimate valuation of the company and an estimate of where the company will get down the line. Now, sometimes investors want to convert on a valuation cap. So even if the valuation of the company comes higher, they will convert on the cap, which is more favorable, gives them more favorable outcome on conversion. So I already talked about this again, but I'll just run through it. So 4 common mistakes we see is that, the startups just download templates and safes and without really understanding the impact of those. They don't specify a pre or post money value to determine the correct conversion, or they incorrectly assume a discount rate is applied to the valuation cap, or they incorrectly, again, document the discount rate. If they're trying to give a 20% discount, they will put 80% as opposed to saying 80% discount, as opposed to saying the discount rate is 80%, which results in a 20% discount. So it's very, be sure to be very specific and clear about those terms. So if we look at the legal documents that every entrepreneur at some point is going to be negotiating or looking at with their investors. So generally what we see is that there's a term sheet. Now, a term sheet essentially is a document which lays out all of the terms and the expectations of both of the parties, so the investor and the startup. What are the rights? Are there going to be voting rights? Are there going to be non-voting rights? What, is there going to be a board? Who's going to be on the board? What level of involvement is this investor going to have? All of those really needs to be planned out in a term sheet. I'll just jump to shareholder agreement. Let's go to subscription agreement for the minute. Now, a subscription agreement, as opposed to a safe note and a convertible note, a subscription agreement is where an investor is going to be buying shares at a predetermined price in the company for new issue of shares. And so they subscribe to the company through a subscription agreement. So it's in contrast and differentiated from a safe note and a convertible note, where it's a future agreement for equity. A subscription agreement is when there's a set price with set terms, and you know what that is, and you're subscribing to the company. Now, ultimately, though, the safe holder, the convertible note holder, and the subscription agreement and investor will all subsequently enter into shareholder agreements when their shares, or when they are given shares, and their either convertible note converts, or the subscription agreement when you're actually given equity. So at some point, you will all be signing and becoming shareholders of the company, and that's where the shareholder agreement comes in. An IP assignment agreement as well is another agreement where you will generally, if you've started with an operating company, for example, the IP has been registered in the name of the operation company, you want to assign that right and IP to the holding company where the investor sits, because it's always very important, and most investors will negotiate that they want to be in the company that owns the assets. After all, that's what adds value to the company. Now, there's employment contracts. Again, they're very important to have with your employees, and particularly if you're going to be structuring an ESOP, so an employment stock option plan or share incentive plan, as they're otherwise also known. Then it's very important to understand what the terms in the employment contract are, and what does your policy look like, to be able to communicate that to the employees and to incentivize them for retention. And of course, you've got the safe and the convertible note, which we've spoken about in some detail. Excellent. So if we look at how to become investor ready, so essentially, most investors want to see that you back your own idea. Most investors want to see that you've bootstrapped in the early stages. You had an idea, you put money to it, you've bootstrapped as best you could, and you really got your idea to the point where you can now speak to an investor and really arouse their, appetite to invest in you. They want to see a developed pitch deck. They want to see the concept. They want to see the idea. It doesn't need to be 100%. It's really interesting because just yesterday on LinkedIn, I read a post by somebody who seems to be a real avid investor. And, one of the downfalls he was saying about startups is that startup, thinking that they have to have this concept and idea 100% ready. You don't have to have it 100% ready, but you need to have a really good idea in order to attract smart money about where you're going, and then how that investor is going to really help you to develop that concept and idea. So have a roadmap of your business. How will you grow it? How will you scale? How will you expand? Ultimately, investors are going to be investing in this for a return on their investment. So how are you going to show them that? You may not have it down pat 100%, but you need to have a really good idea and be able to pitch that to the investor. What you need to also do, and I think the best startups really have plans to pivot the business. So, if things don't go to plan, how are you going to pivot? What's your plan? You want to hope for the best, but you need to also plan for the worst. The other, point, and I think is a real takeaway point, is to understand your target investor. Who would be that ideal investor? Why? And then knowing your why will help you to really pitch that idea to them. And then, of course, assessing how much do you need. You don't want to raise too much money, but you don't want to under-raise either, where you need to go into another round too quickly and dilute the shareholding in the cap table. And the other thing is to have your legal documents ready. And please, not just because we're a law firm and I'm a lawyer that obviously always encourages to have your legal documents in place, but if you don't understand what they say and you've signed those without knowing what the implications are, you could be having a very sensitive discussion down the line, which you could potentially save yourself from. So that's really my advice to startups and founders. What I'm going to do, because I see we've got some time, I don't want to run after time today, but we do have a little bit of time. So I'm going to look at the Q&As for the moment and see if we can answer some of those. So we have an anonymous attendee. If the startup requests the investor to not sell his shares unless all parties agreed on the new buyer, will that prevent the startup from getting fund from investors, as the new buyer may not understand the business nature and avoid troubles with him? Okay, so I'm not 100% sure what this is asking. I think what this is asking is that a startup doesn't want an investor to sell shares. Now, basic 101 principle of corporate commercial law is that if you are a shareholder in a company, usually what we see is there's a preemption right or first right of refusal. So the first right of refusal is if you're a shareholder who wants to sell shares, then you would normally go to the existing shareholders and ask them if they want to buy you shares. Now, only after they've dismissed or said that they don't wish to exercise that right, then you've got the potential to go out to a third party and sell that share to them. So there's already that mechanism in place which you can build into the commercial contracts to limit any shareholder from selling a share to a third party before he's offered it to existing shareholders. So I hope that answers your question for that anonymous attendee. There's also a preemption right, and a preemption right in a company is where the company is going to be issuing new shares, but they offer it to the existing shareholders to see if they want to participate and own more shares in the company as well. So that's a little bit different, but I thought that might just give you some understanding as well of how of the different sort of options that a shareholder has and how to provide it to a third party. So I'll go to the next question. If I've not answered that one for this anonymous, please, write back and maybe clarify the question a little. So we didn't raise funds yet, but are the investors having the final decision on the strategy, or the founders have the decision? So ultimately, you as the founder has the decision on the strategy of your business, and whoever invests in you will generally like the strategy or invest in you and say, I'd like the strategy, but I think we can also do A, B, C and add more value. Now, as a founder, if that sounds good to you and they're adding value and you think that they could scale up or help you to generate more revenues and funds, then why not? But ultimately, who has the final decision is the person who owns a majority of the business. And in the very early stages, it'll be the founders. So I hope that's answered that question. So Mr. Kerry Khalil asked to please mention the incubators again. So what I will do is have one of my colleagues send you an email or send you this presentation where you can see the incubators. And we also have, if you go onto our website, I think we've got a entire booklet on all of the different incubators there are in the UAE. So I can ask one of my colleagues to send that through to those who are interested. So another question is how to build relation with investors if you don't know them. It's clear that you're contacting them for the purposes of getting funds, not like if you build relations with investors, they don't know that you will request. So I think the question really is, how do you develop a relationship? And sometimes you will have to go cold turkey, and that means that it'll be knocking on an investor door and saying, look, I've got this great idea and I think that you could be a potential great investor, and let me tell you why. And it's really just opening a dialogue and opening a communication for you to speak with that investor. Other times, in the very early stages where you're doing a family and friends round, for example, you already know them, so you already have a relationship. But what you want to be doing is, in the early stages, at least if you're going to go cold turkey, knock on the door of an investor has other relationships and other investors within his network so that he can make those introductions. So I find that most of the startups that have done that have a much easier time fundraising than knocking on investors' doors who they have absolutely no relations with. So can you explain more about the cap table? For that anonymous attendee, I don't know exactly what it is about the cap table that you want me to explain more about. So if you maybe make that question a little more clearer for me, I can come back to that. Is it easy to raise funds for the company registered in Delaware from UAE investors? Look, in our experience, it's not difficult to raise funds if you've got a very compelling pitch deck and a very compelling business. We've seen lots of clients who have set up in Delaware, but then moved, for example, to either the ADGM or the IFC because the investors were more comfortable. But I guess, again, this is about having an open dialogue with the investor and seeing what the requirements are. Like, if for example, if you've participated in a Y Combinator and made it into, say, their cohorts or programs, they will mandate that you've set up a holding company in a Cayman, a BVI, or in another jurisdiction. So, if you really badly want to get into that, you will change the structure of your company. So remember, the structure of the company is quite fluid, and there isn't a right or wrong place to do it. It really comes back to you, your structure, and the investors, and where they're happy to invest. So the next question, to whom shall we go to get the cap table prepared if we haven't experienced that before? So law firms who practice in this area can generally do it. So for example, we do it for most of our clients, but also accountants will know how to prepare a cap table, particularly accountants that have dealt with startups before. But I'm happy for anyone to come back to Legal Circle and ask us some questions on cap table, and if we can help to prepare those, we will. So the next question is how to know or select the right legal company to deal with upon investment process. Exactly. So what you want to be doing is you want to be asking that law firm, who within their law firm has actually worked on startups and fundraising before, what experience they have, maybe give you examples of the startups that they've helped to support. As I said again, one of the reasons why we're doing this presentation is to become aware of some of the considerations that you need to be making, some of the questions that you can even be asking potential law firms, and then also to let you know that we do this and we help for cost-effective prices. So if you do need this, please reach out to us. So another question I have is, can you please confirm that the legal documents, term sheet, shareholder agreements can be governed by the English law in the UAE? Yes. So Mr. Balbak, if you are fundraising and either in the ADGM or the DIFC, they're both based on English law and common law principles. So in your governing law clause, be sure to confirm and reiterate and make very clear the governing law and jurisdiction of the agreement will be in relation to England and Wales, and either be in the DIFC or the ADGM. So I hope that answers that question. I've got another question. Would you recommend a holding structure at a seed round? Personally, I recommend a holding structure whenever you have the funds to do it, because it just saves you the hassle from having to do it later on. And if you've got too many investors in an operational company, it becomes an administrative nightmare later to move all of those and to get the consent of everybody and sign documentation and pay for all the filings at later stages. So if you've got the right structure in place from the very beginning, it does make things administratively and also more cost effective down the line. So I have another question on SPV. So during the SPV setup with new investors, do we need to modify existing operational entity shareholder structure? So no, essentially what happens when you've set up the SPV, you will transfer 100% of the operational company to the SPV. So you'll have the SPV own 100% of the operational entity. So essentially it does change the structure of and shareholding of the operations, rather than it being, for example, 50% in the co-founder's name and 50% split amongst other investors. It'll be 100% owned by the holding, and in the holding, you'll have your different splits. I hope that answers that question. And I thank you for all your inputs. Well, thank you for all the questions, and I hope that I've answered all of those. If there are any more, please type those into the chat box. Otherwise, I'll just take a minute to let you know about how we can help. So what we have done as part of being part of Astrolabs and trying to support many of the startups that we know, for example, are bootstrapping and have lots of questions to ask a lawyer, but don't necessarily have the funds to retain a lawyer long-term to draft all of the agreements. We've got cost-effective packages which we've priced at $299 per month and gives you unlimited sort of questions and answers with a lawyer, similar to what we're doing now, but if there's any specific questions, and gives you a set number of documents that you might need as well. So it's a long-term retainer where you can partner with us for a very minimal amount and have all of your questions answered and really have a legal partner with you along your journey. So, if this is of interest to you, please in the chat box or in the Q&A, let us know. We can reach out to you, and we can, of course, provide you with the support you need. And I think Burbeck has just asked, how much do legal firms charge for documents preparing, drafting, and assisting in fundraising? Let me tell you, if you do your market research, fundraising and fundraising lawyers are probably one of the most expensive. It's not an easy area of law. It's quite complex. But we understand that, of course, startups really require the support and assistance. So we've put together a very cost-effective package to give you that support, so we can partner with you. So please reach out to us if that is of interest to you. I think some other questions are coming through. Let me see. So I've got another question here that says, from the investment, how much amount do founders set as their salary? So again, this is a very subjective question. It really comes back to your books, how much funds you have, and how much you can pay yourself at the minute. So I've seen founders pay themselves a very little amount and then increase that as they increase the funds and as their scope and work increases as well. So there isn't a set amount. It's very subjective. Work with your accountant to put it on your books and to see what profitability or what your profitability looks like at the end of the day. Having so many people with different salaries and being able to maintain that. I can see lots of I can see lots and lots of questions, or I guess comments in the chat box, but I think most of these are just comments and not questions. So I think I've answered most of the questions in the Q&A. Unless there are more, I think it's time to wrap up the session, as I can see that it's almost an hour into the presentation, but I am happy for you to reach out, to leave your number, leave your emails if you do wish to avail any of the subscription that we have, or if you've just got legal questions and want to be guided, you can set up a quick consultation. We're happy to do that as well. I have somebody who's raised their hand. So I think that person who's just raised their hand, if you can write your question in the Q&A and I'll have that answered for you. But I'm only on here for another couple of minutes before we need to close and wrap up for the day. So if you can, please, in the Q&A box. I have another question just come through. I have another way, which is having investors for every single entity per country. Kindly confirm. So this comes back to, what is your operations? Where are your operations? Why do you need an investor in every single country, as opposed to having it streamlined in one entity, which funnels the funds that it needs into the different operational entities around the country? So when you are bringing on investors and you're looking at a structure, you need to think of, what is the purpose, what is the benefit, and why I'm structuring the company in that way. And so I think what we need to do is learn a little bit more about your business, about your operations, to really give you the best answer in terms of structure. So Sadad Hassan, I know you're asking me to answer your question, but I don't see your question. Perhaps you can tell me what your question is in the question and answer box. But I do have only another couple of minutes, so I don't want to cut it short, but please do reach out to us if there are specific questions. So, is it a must to convert your license from an establishment to an LLC upon getting fund upon MVP, or can we continue as an establishment? No. So if you are a sole establishment, that's not a conducive structure at all for investors who are coming in to give you funds. Remember, when an investor comes in, they obviously want a stake in your company, and they want to be protected as a shareholder, and therefore you will need to have a company structure which gives shareholding to investors ultimately. I've got a quick question. Would you suggest setting up an SPV in a free zone as opposed to onshore? Yes, absolutely. It wouldn't make sense to set up an onshore one. I suggest an SPV in the DIFC or the ADGM or somewhere else offshore, which is designed for a holding company. Now, holding companies are different from operational entities. Holding companies simply hold the operational entities. They don't, in fact, operate as such. So usually the onshore companies will be the operational ones. I hope I've answered that for you, Elise. Sadat, I've just seen your question come through. How do we approach these angel investing companies if I'm a very new startup with a basic bootstrap situation? There is no two ways about it. You simply have to put a pitch deck together and go out and speak to as many people as you can to gain interest and to see who it is has appetite for your particular business and business model in the market. I've got another question about our package. So does the package include review and legal advice on agreements outside fundraising? Yes, absolutely, if you do need it. It's not unlimited, but of course, I think in the startup package, you get at least about 2 documents that we can review and advise on. So we've got lots of our clients giving us introducer agreements, NDAs, service agreements, e-commerce, privacy policies, and all of that we've looked at as well. Yes, so we are a multidisciplinary law firm. A large part of the work that we do is helping startups to support and fundraise and support them through the fundraising process. But we also do employment law, real estate, corporate, commercial, drafting, reviewing, general legal documents as well. So we are multidisciplinary. So thank you so much for all those who have attended. Thank you so much for those who have stayed on to listen to the questions and answers. If there's anything that you need beyond this, please reach out to us. Leave your number, leave your emails, and we will give you a call to set up a one-on-one quick consultation with you, find out how we can further support your needs. So without further ado, thank you for all those who attended. Thank you, Astrolabs, for hosting this with us today. And if you'd like to see more on this and like to see on specific topics, please do let us know. Without further ado, I'm going to stop the session for today and have a great day ahead. I look forward to seeing and hearing you from you in the future presentations. Thank you so much.